I'd like to introduce our moderator for our next panel. Gail has served 4 terms in the Montana State Legislature, and she's currently a candidate for the Public Service Commission in District 4, and we're excited that she's going to be here and help moderate this panel, and she will introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming today. In the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief on the introductions, and I'm going to introduce you all in the order that you'll be speaking. So, and I'm also going to be a timekeeper, so if you see me flash at you, you'll know you only have 5 minutes left. So the first speaker is Evan Barrett, and Evan, as most of you know, has a lengthy, distinguished career in economic development. He currently serves as the Chief Business Development Officer in Governor Schweitzer's Office of Economic Development, a position he's held since January 2005. If you all want longer bios on these folks, it's in your nice book that you got with this conference. The second speaker is Mark Lambrecht. He currently serves as PPL Montana's Regulatory Affairs Manager, where he's responsible for overseeing the company's regulatory activities, particularly as they relate to the Montana Public Service Commission, the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the Montana Legislature, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He has 20 years of experience in natural resource policy and environmental regulation. The third speaker is Gail Small, and Gail is the executive director of the nonprofit organization Native Action, which she founded along with a team of Cheyenne leaders in 1984. It was one of the first nonprofit organizations on an Indian reservation. The fourth speaker will be Ann Hedges, and Ann has been the program director and lead lobbyist for the Montana Environmental Information Center since 1993. MEIC lobbies the state legislature, monitors state government, educates the public about health and environmental issues, and provides citizens with organizing and technical assistance. And last but not least will be Bob Rainey. Bob Rainey was elected to the Montana Public Service Commission in November of 2004. He serves as a member of the governor's Climate Change Task Force, Great Plains Coal Gasification Work Group, and National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners Task Force on Climate Policy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel, and the name of this panel is The Montana Solution, Renewables, Clean Technology, and Economic Development. And I don't think I need to do a lead-in for these guys, because I think there'll be plenty of opinions on both sides here that will give you lots of opportunities for questions. So thank you. We'll turn it over to Evan.
Thank you. Thank you. One of these is for moving things and one is for a pointer. This is a more macho pointer. See, it's got a little more to it, so I've got to be ambidextrous here. But happy to be here and talk about the energy policies of the Schweitzer administration, how they fit into the Montana situation, how they fit into the national and the global situation. Because Montana's a player all the way around on this thing. And so the focus of this is on energy independence. Clean and green issues, trying to make sure what we do with energy is done right, and jobs and growth, the economic opportunities that come with it. Our policies, and anybody's policies in Montana, but to have an impact on 3 different levels. Internationally with global climate change, nationally with energy independence, and inside the state boundaries with things that's jobs and growth that can be built around energy, particularly in areas that suffer chronic dislocation. And this is the perspective we bring on it. Now, very quickly onto global climate change. Today we're going to talk, because it's about renewables, we're going to talk about wind, biofuels, briefly on geothermal, and then coal, because it's such a huge resource here. We're going to, because of the time frame, we're not going to go heavily into oil and gas. We're not going to go heavily into coal bed methane. We're more than happy to answer questions about those, however. On energy independence, I'm going to give you just a quick look. The governor does this with an awful lot of a sense of understanding because he spent a lot of time in the Middle East. But this is where we are right now. Obviously, this is Kuwait right here, and this is 1,000 nautical miles around from Kuwait, which is right at the right at the tip of the Persian Gulf, where the Iraq war is going on right now. And if you look at that, that goes from Russia all the way to Somalia, and from Egypt all the way over here past Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's only 1,000 miles. Now to give it, and of course, the issue about energy independence is about the fact that right now, at least one substantial reason among the myriad list of reasons we've been given for being there, one of them that it's never said is it's about oil. And it's about oil because it all comes from around in here. All the oil that comes in from here, and most of it comes out through the Strait of Hormuz here, and there's guns trained on that right now by Iran. And if they wanted to plunk it down there and knock a couple tankers down, then we'd see oil instead of $80 a barrel, maybe $200 a barrel instantaneously. So there are issues about energy independence that relate to this, but also this is still about people, about our national treasury and human sacrifice being made because this is an area of great import related to oil. That's a comparison of that same circle with the United States. It's interesting. Think of all of that area inside that circle, and that's all it represents in the United States. To go from the center of that up to the top is just a one-day drive. Okay? Montana, incidentally, is about the size of Iraq. Okay? Sense of perspective about when we talk about doing things about energy independence in this nation and about our treasury and our blood of this country, it's about a lot of important things here that when we talk about how do we get there? How do we get there? Now, the Energy Independence Challenge is delineated this way. We currently use 6.5 billion barrels of oil a year. We produce 2.5 billion. We import 4. If we think that's a shortfall, how do we make up the shortfall? Well, the governor's perspective is with conservation and energy, we can make up about 1 billion barrels. Biofuels about 1 billion, and there are limits on what we can do with biofuels, just because it affects foodstuffs and food prices. Okay. And then finally, I don't know if you can see this, but at the bottom there is coal to liquid, hybrids, and plug-ins. That those can represent about 2 billion barrels a year. Create your own mix. But we need to have a strategy of how to bridge this gap as a country. And it can be a different combination if you want to emphasize it that way. In terms of jobs and growth, you do economic development based upon the comparative advantages you have and competitive advantages. Our comparative advantages are what we have naturally. So we have minerals, forest products, agriculture, energy. Those are our comparative advantages. And most of those point to energy-related opportunities. Ethanol, biodiesel, different ways to deal with coal, wind farms, exploration, production, and refineries related to oil and gas. This is opportunity. You don't have the Saturn plant automatically. You know, there's got to be an economic reason for things to happen. One is comparative advantage. So you can kind of see we have opportunity here. Now we talk about the boot economy. And the boot economy is really this area, that area of the state that you see there outlined as a boot economy is the size of a mid-sized state in the United States. And if it were a state, it would be one of the fastest growing states in America. We are already, as a state, one of the fastest growing states in America. That area would probably be number 1. So we have an island of prosperity in Montana. When you live in that island of prosperity, it's easy to forget about what's around it, which is a sea of economic dislocation. Outmigration, families leaving, families being broken apart because the economy cannot sustain you when you live in a lot of these areas of eastern Montana. So what did we want to do outside the boot? If we want, and by the way, there are people that say, well, to the governor, I just ride the crest of all that economic activity inside the boot. But you know, the governor says he's not elected governor of the boot, he was elected governor of the state. And we have people out there whose families are dependent upon us making a serious effort to create economic opportunity where they live. So what is the biggest opportunity there? It is in energy development, without question. It's not the only opportunity. There will be more. And there are other things, technology things and so on, but that's where we get the opportunity. So what is the governor's policy for doing energy development outside the boot? Well, take advantages of all the advantages we have there, all the forms of energy. We're not trying to pick and choose. We would like to see all opportunities pursued within certain contexts. Here's one of the contexts. Doing it right. Doing it right. We don't have to develop energy the way it was always developed in the past. Like everything else, there's been transitions. So we can have a quality of life and quality jobs at the same time. That's the way Montana needs to do it. And lastly, if you can see it, those of you up above probably can, clean and green, and that's for both ourselves, our kids, our grandkids, okay, but also to meet the demands of the market. Because the market is moving rapidly in that direction, and we'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk about the first renewable, which is wind. This is a map of the United States. The darker it is, the more the wind potential. There's Montana there, and you can kind of see we have more wind potential than any state in the nation. We're number one in class 3 and above wind potential. Now at this stage of the game, all we have is 2 commercial farms. That's 144 megawatts. So we got more potential and not much growth yet in it, though the future looks pretty good. When we put those 2 wind farms online, we went from number 50 to number 15 in the nation in commercial wind power development. This is just a sampling of prospective and proposed wind farms, and there's more than that. I've just been too lazy to fix up the slide. But actually, right here, there's a big green proposed target there that's very, very important. And that's a 300 megawatt wind farm, which would be in and of itself a 200% increase of what we're producing right now commercially in Montana. And that's the McCormick Ranch Wind Park between Cut Bank and Shelby. Now, so when that comes online, and it requires the MATL, Montana Alberta tie line, to carry that 300 megawatts. That line is built to take 600 megawatts, going 2 ways, okay? So this is pending MATL final decision. This will be coming online. That's the company in charge of it. We've committed ourselves as a state to wind power development. We have renewable energy portfolio standards, requires 15% of the total portfolio to be renewable by 2015. We have 7 tax incentives that relate to wind power. Senator Baucus passed the Clean and Renewable Energy Bonds Bill, of which about 30 Montana communities qualified for initially, which is a way to advance smaller wind projects, okay, community-based. So there's a lot of commitment policy-wise. The body politic has spoken and said, we like wind. And so we have to pursue that. What are the challenges? The challenges for wind are transmission and firming. Now, transmission lines, some people don't like them. Somebody told me the other day, I kind of liked it. They said, you know, I like that wind power, it's just got to be wireless. And I thought, well, you know, there's a technology we could shoot for, but we're not there yet. In the meantime, we need transmission lines to move power, or else all this wind can just blow, okay? And firming, it doesn't blow all the time. And most of this is about natural gas or other, there's a way you can firm wind on wind, and we're hopeful to see wind on wind firming, but we're also natural gas as a vehicle for firming. And there probably will be a couple plants developed here to do it. So now, biofuels. Again, a renewable in where Montana, you know, has great opportunity. Why do we have opportunity? Well, we're the 4th biggest state. It all starts with land. 145,000 square miles in the state, 16.5 million acres are right now the best suited to the seed oil crops. That is one of the primary ways to move to biofuels, okay? And then we have 19 million acres of non-reserve forest land where appropriately done, you can use that to get biomass opportunities, which not only can do biofuels, but can help in gasification technology to create maybe even a carbon positive footprint rather than other problems. So the forest land's a big part of it. So again, our validity in this area is based upon, again, the nature of Montana. We have the space to do it. And we have 2 state-level production incentives that are in place here and have been in place for quite a long time, and a 10% ethanol blending requirement that was passed in 2005. And we have biodiesel tax credits, which Representative Gucci is the sponsor of several of those. And they continue to be in play here. Now, this is a slowly evolving field. This is a bunch of prospective plants, but why aren't they all coming online? Here's a bunch of prospective biodiesel. The first one were ethanol. What about ethanol plants? What is the problem with ethanol? The problem with ethanol is we have to compete ethanol-wise with the people that produce corn in Iowa. You know, it's tough to compete against that. That's a cheap source of what you need to do ethanol. And we're trying to find ways to use, there's not a lot of places in Montana where you can do corn like that. Plus, we've got, and if you heard Ron Erickson earlier, he talked about the nature of the clean and green incentive being with non-food stuff, you know, ethanol. Because why did we have tortilla riots, corn tortilla riots in Mexico? Was because the price of corn was being pushed up by ethanol. So if we want to have a collision between food and energy, ethanol is where it might happen. So we're all for ethanol, but we recognize there's some limitations on how often it can be done and how it can be done. And it takes some creative technology ways to do it. And I think we have some folks here that know a lot about that here. Biodiesel, again, a lot of prospective plants. Some of them are going. The nice thing about biodiesel is it's scalable from a garage to a football field or to the size of half of Missoula. I mean, it's fully scalable, where ethanol almost has to be very big to make it work economically. So we see a little more potential in biodiesel, but we still we want to do as much ethanol as possible. I want to mention the WIRED grant from the feds, so that we're trying to develop an economy in eastern Montana around the opportunities in biofuels and biodevelopment with the $15 million grant, which is about improving the workforce to be able to handle the jobs associated with biofuels development. This is the WIRED region out there. Does that look familiar? Look at that. It's the area east of the Butte. And that's the area where we're focused on with that. Now, what are the challenges? The challenges here are technology. What are the technologies we can do to get the most bang for the buck and the most effective creation of fuel, given some of the challenges, especially the ethanol challenge, but there's technology challenges in biodiesel as well. The market, hey, we're not much of a market, so it's got to get to market. And basically, ethanol doesn't flow through pipelines. It can, but traditionally it hasn't. And finally, crops. What are the crops we're going to be using? And crops are being advanced. The seed oil crops are being improved every year to get more production. So from canola, camelina looks like it's got the best possibilities, but it's not quite there yet, but almost. So these are the 3 challenges when you talk about biofuels. I'm going to touch briefly on geothermal, another renewable. And that's, by the way, a geothermal plant. And that terrible smoke right there is actually just steam. A very, very good renewable. And we're starting to move. The state of Montana has already got a lot of data gathered and stuff, and starting to move in the direction of seeing what we can do with geothermal. I hope that's visible. These are the hot geothermal regions. See, Montana's right about there. in the hot geothermal regions around the world. But if you look here in the geothermal power plants, there's none up in our area. So there is opportunity with geothermal, which is another renewable that we need to be looking at. And there's going to be a lot of challenges in that. Now we're going to talk about coal here because coal is not a renewable, but it is opportunity and energy independence, and it's worth considering doing coal, assuming we do coal right. And this is our reserves of coal. We have 28% of the national reserves and 8% of the world's reserves of coal. So we're in serious coal country here. If you look at it, that's where coal is in Montana. Right there is the bituminous coal. And subbituminous is there and lignite is there. Now lignite, by the way, we have more of that than anything. It's the cheapest coal, but it's wetter, lower BTU, doesn't transport well. Mine mouth activity is almost required for the proper use of lignite. But we have a lot of coal there. This is our historic coal production in Montana. This is not a political commercial. However, it is worth noting, it is a factual thing, that the growth in coal occurred in the blue years, and right now it's starting to go up again. And what we want to see is coal go up like that on the assumption that we can do it right. And so it's going to take all of us politically pulling in harness to make that happen. If we can get the right kind of productive use, but that's the opportunities. Now, let's compare what we're doing with coal here in Montana to Wyoming. In 1988, there was 4 times as much production in Wyoming as there is in Montana. And we stayed fairly flat for the ensuing 16 years, and they went up to 400 million tons from 160, and it's a 10-to-1 ratio now. Okay, most of that in Wyoming is being shipped to market. That's not what we're interested in doing in Montana. We don't want to become Wyoming. Is there any surprise in that? But what can we do with the coal and do it right? Because we have the opportunities. This map here is just to give you a sense, because ultimately you have to do the development, you do it where the resource is and where the infrastructure can support it. So this map shows where pipelines and power lines are, and you can kind of see that they're running through energy areas, and that provides opportunities in there. And this one, the other one, although it's a little harder to see, is the same thing applies to railroads and roads. That basically highways, railroads, pipelines, and transmission lines juxtaposed to the resource provide the best opportunity for economic growth areas. And it coincidentally happens to be where we have economic dislocation in the state. Now, what is the present for coal? I'm talking about the present for coal both in Montana, Wyoming, and then we'll look to the future. It's primarily about coal being mined and shipped to power plants. That's what's happening today with coal. Most of it goes to pulverized coal plants, which is the 1960s and 70s technology, always being updated and upgraded. And by the way, our plants in Montana, compared to a lot of others, are relatively clean, even though inherently coal burning is not clean. They're relatively clean to others. CFB, this is a picture of the proposed one in Great Falls. That's the cleanest of the technologies that burn coal. But right now, that's what we do with coal in this country, is we ship it and we burn it. And then we come out with problems right here, and potentially here, a little less so, a lot less so. However, we have to do something about, that's what we have to do something about. So, the future. What is the future? Well, the future is a hydrogen economy, it's fuel cells. Long range, that's where it's at. The future is having clean and renewable energy choices. All right, that's where we're going in terms of that. So it is solar and hydro, as well as geothermal and wind. in the future, those are the kind of choices. But what is our challenge? Our challenge is that 50% of the power provided in this country today comes from coal. And though coal plants that produce that represent, and I'm probably stealing a little bit of Mark's stuff, but represent trillions of dollars of investment, that investment will not go away overnight. The reliance upon that coal power will not go away overnight. So the trick is, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? We have to find a bridge to the new energy future. How do we get there in a meaningful fashion? Okay? And part of that bridge is clean coal. And clean coal, the governor's perspective on it is, when we're going to do it, we ought to do it clean and green, as much as it can possibly be done. And we know there are technological limitations, but from a policy objective, use coal, do it clean and green, and we can bridge to the long-range future when renewables and the new forms of energy like fuel cells take over. Now, we have a bunch of incentives on clean and green that I think Representative Erickson talked about this morning. I won't dwell on them. But basically anything on the clean and green chart, coal to liquid, coal to gas, IGCCs, biofuels, et cetera, renewable manufacturing, research and development equipment, get a significant tax break in Montana in the future. But there are threshold issues and also pipelines and transmission lines that are clean and green, and they go down 75% in taxes. But here's the thresholds. It's got to be a clean product. And that inherently means that CO2 sequestration has to be part of the whole business plan to make it work. It has to be new investment, and they have to be built with prevailing wage rates. Good quality construction jobs, as well as the good quality jobs that come once you get into production. So, what is the bridge to the future? Well, first, retrofitting existing plants. Again, if we got trillions of dollars of investment, what are we going to do? Tear them down and get a bunch of squirrels running around in a cage to produce power? Can't do that. We've got to find a rational way to move forward. First thing is to retrofit. Make them cleaner. That's a lot of what Richard Opper was talking about. What do? We got to, and Mark will talk about this. The bridge is also coal to syngas, turning coal into synthetic gas. What's the trick here? You don't burn it. It's a chemical reaction. You put it in a great big thermos bottle, about 150 feet high and 40 feet wide, and you put a catalyst in there and you seal it up and you superheat it from the outside and you create chemical reactions. And there's no emission coming out like that. And your net effect of that is, this is, by the way, Beulah, which is the one thing that emerged out of the syn-fuel efforts in the 70s with Jimmy Carter when we had those problems with the energy back then. But coal to syngas is a way to move things forward in a clean way, okay? And the syngas can be used for non-combustion electric power, IGCC, we'll talk about that in a second, for plants, homes, and vehicles, and alternative liquid fuels, coal to liquid, coal to diesel, okay? Now, IGCC plants are part of that bridge. Now sure, this stuff is cutting edge, but we better go cutting edge if we're going to make progress in this country. Now, IGCCs produce that power that can be used for vehicles, it can be used for homes and plants. And it's clean as long as it has the carbon sequestration, which is an issue we'll get to quickly. This is why we do it. I like this chart because it shows with a traditional national, by the way, these figures are national averages. Ours in Montana are lower than this, but the national average for NOx in a coal-fired plant is up here. When you do a Fischer-Tropsch coal to liquid with CO2 sequestration, it goes all the way down to there. And when you use SO2, sulfur dioxide, it goes from there down to there. And when you use, here's CO2, greenhouse gas. There's where it is, goes down to there when you do carbon sequestration. And it even works with particulate, though to a lesser degree. Those arrows point to the reason why we have to go to new technology. They make this stuff happen. Coal to liquid. Some people want to argue a lot about this, and there are arguments to be had. But this is part of our solution and our bridge, and it also deals directly with the energy independence issue because it's liquid fuel. Okay. Now, by the way, some people have talked about water being a problem, and I thought I'd just put this up here right away. If you took an 11,000 barrel CTL plant a day and you use the worst ratio, because the ratio of water to liquid produced ranges from 1 to 1 to 1 to 7, depending on the technology and the analysis. So I took the worst case scenario, 7 barrels of water for every barrel of fuel. Okay, and so that is the acre feet that are required for a plant this size. Okay, and this is the sector here. For example, one of those plants would represent 0.4% of the industrial sector use of water today. It would represent 4/1000ths of 1% of the irrigation use in Montana. It represents 5/1000ths of what's used for power generation in Montana. So you can see it's a lot of water, and it probably will be half that. Maybe it's going to be 3.5 to 1 instead of 7 to 1. But it's not undoable, let me assure you. And that down there says one of those plants uses the same amount of water as irrigating 1,800 acres of alfalfa. This is not the end of the earth, folks. This is doable stuff if we commit ourselves to doing it and doing it right. This is the key to doing it right, is carbon sequestration. Okay, this map I'll show quickly. These are the hot spots for sequestration in Montana. The MSU Carbon Sequestration Coalition is leading the DOE is putting serious money into this stuff. Okay, we have the opportunities here. Partially putting it in the ground and capturing it in domes that'll stay there, and partially putting it in where it can enhance oil recovery, EOR. Beulah, North Dakota produces syngas, which is shipped 204 miles from Beulah up to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, okay, and it's 5,000 tons a day going through that pipeline. And that will produce over a 20-year period 130 million additional barrels out of there. That's a temporary initial way to use it. And then the idea is how can you capture it there? And how can you find the domes to put it in? Here are some challenges. Challenges for CO2 sequestration right now, 2 major challenges. What is the technology to make sure you can do it? And the U.S. government's investing a lot of money in that, okay? And we'll figure it out. And what is the legal framework that determines how you can do it? Who owns that dome? Who has the liability, responsibility for it, and so on? This is a law school. That legal framework is a big part of this. So those are the challenges that we primarily face. Let me see how we're doing here. Doing pretty good. I lost the slide on challenges, which is why I was ad-libbing that. I want to say that we had some additional legislation on energy in terms of the budget. We created an infrastructure promotion and development program in Commerce Department for energy. And that's about transmission lines and pipelines predominantly, but roads and railroads as well. Any infrastructure that can support energy development. We put some money in there for 4 staff positions, and we located it in Commerce and work with us very heavily. In addition, in the last legislature, in addition to the clean and green incentives, which is a major piece of legislation, and again, Representative Erickson talked about it earlier, so I'm not going to dwell on it. The research and commercialization money we have in Montana has now got a 20% target for clean coal and renewables. New target for research money in Montana. And we want to draw a lot of federal research money in too. So why are we pushing? And I want to do this quickly. Why do we push for the green power, clean coal development? Well, we're the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to coal is Montana. But when it comes to energy consumption, the 800-pound gorilla is California. So how big is the gorilla down there in California and the West? In the next 20 years, California is going to add 21,000 megawatts of power. That's the equivalent of Colstrip 1, 2, 3, and 4 10 times over, just for the growth. In the West, the CDAC report shows 30,000 megawatts by 2015. I heard a report today that in the next 20 years, the national consumption of electrical power will rise by 42%. Okay, demand is there, okay? But is the demand green? Yeah, it's green. Legally in California, to import power, it must meet IGCC standards. Greatly reduced emissions with the capture of greenhouse gases as part of the formula. They want to be 20% green mix of their power by 2010 and 33% of that huge power base by 2020. So this is a market-driven thing. This isn't just a philosophy thing. It's nice if it's philosophy. We're all for it. It's the right thing to do. But guess what? It works a lot better if the market says do it too, right? So we can serve the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, and California. We can serve those areas. These bulbs represent energy consumption. So that's where energy is consumed, in those areas out there. Not up here. You know, we're not a big consumer right here in Montana compared to all this. But that's where the energy is generated, Montana and Wyoming. So the trick is how to get it from there out to there. And that's where transmission lines come in. Okay, we need more transmission lines from Montana to emerging markets. Northern Lights line, take 2 seconds on that. This is a high voltage direct current line. You see that spin? I put it in there because I knew how to do it. You know. Now, what about these HVDC, high voltage direct current? It's like a superhighway. If the grid is kind of like every street and alley in a town, you can go anywhere you want. A HVDC line's like the interstate. You got on and off ramps, and you just go between them. And there's some. What does it mean? Well, one, it's easier permitting because it's environmentally friendlier. Okay, this is a AC corridor, and this is a DC corridor. And it also is less line loss, better engineering. So we're looking with these folks, major Canadian company, TransCanada, at a line like this. It would go down to those markets. And matching difficultly, with a great deal of difficulty, the generators and the market. Because under federal law, by the way, the transmission line can't connect those people up and get them to talk to each other. They can't say, hey, would you talk to this person? It's not allowed. So that's one of the roles the state will play in this kind of thing. Estimated value, about a $2 billion project, about $600 million in Montana. Montana, Alberta tie line, I mentioned that earlier. That's a line between Great Falls, Montana, and Lethbridge, Alberta. Okay, and that's permitting is almost completed on that. 600 megawatts, 300 going north and 300 probably going south, okay? It's an AC line. It'll be followed by some others. Dedicated exclusively and contracted for at this time for wind power. Montana Central and North Central Montana wind. Okay? Misty, Montana Interstate tie something or other, I don't know. What it is it's an improvement between roughly Garrison or Townsend up above Butte on down into Idaho. And that opens up through AC lines, a movement to new markets. And lastly, possible BPA improvements right in there, which will allow a little more to flow over those lines to the West Coast without adding towers and stuff like that. Those 4 projects alone, and there'll be more smaller projects that will meet the needs of moving wind power. Basically, this is the 3 renewables and coal. And what we're doing is spending a huge amount of time working on this. Why? Because of the 3 things it can do. Again, where we started. It can help us as a nation deal with the issue of energy independence. Very important for us from a policy perspective as well as an economic perspective. It can help us, we're focused on clean and green. do it right. Remember, we can have quality jobs that come with energy development without sacrificing our quality of life if we are policy-wise committed to doing that. And we'll get in harness and do it together right. And it can create jobs and growth where they're needed in Montana. Because of those three things, the governor is committed to an aggressive energy policy. The state seems to like that. We welcome the opportunity to work with everybody to do it right. I want to mention that if you go to that website, www.business.mt.gov, that's our website at our office, the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And there's an energy page referred to on the upper right. And you click on that energy page, and there's a bunch of stuff there. You can download a lot of this kind of stuff that we have here, a lot of reports, and so on. And you can download the, I forgot to bring over the Governor's energy policy. You can download that. Why kill a tree, huh? We can all just get on the internet and do it. So you can go there, and this is our contact information. So I look forward to the dialogue. We look forward to doing this and doing it right in a Montana way. And we think it can make a big difference. So we'll look forward to the other speakers and going from there. I think I made it in time, didn't I? Thank you.
All right, everything's working. Thanks for sticking with me this long. Once again, I get a late afternoon slot, but that's okay. Just wanted to thank Kelly Hubbard, where did she disappear to, for inviting me today, and for the university for hosting this. This has been very educational for me, but it's especially sweet for me to be back in this building. I was a grad student here about 15 years ago across campus at the forestry school, but I came over here to take a public land law class from the late Marjorie Brown, and I can say without a doubt that was one of the most demanding yet rewarding experiences I've ever been through. She was truly a gracious professor. And I think the toughness of that course was maybe exceeded only by Dick Barrett's resource economics class that I survived. And is he still here? If he is, I hope he's not going to be grading this presentation. Well, I wanted to get into this. PPL Montana is a wholesale and retail generator of electricity in Montana. We have over 500 employees around the state, most of which are at the Colstrip facility. And our corporate offices are in Billings. And we also operate an energy operation, marketing operation in Butte. That's really a trading floor of sorts. We are a subsidiary of PPL Corporation, which is based in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I mentioned Colstrip. Part of the 1,200 megawatts of generating capacity that we have with coal-fired and hydroelectric facilities. Most of that's at the Colstrip facility in eastern Montana. That's about 2,100 megawatts. And we operate on that on behalf of our partners, which are Avista, Northwestern Energy, Puget Sound Energy, Portland General Electric, and Pacificor. This is where our facilities are located. Hydroelectric facilities up here on the Clark Fork River, Flathead River, Missouri River system, all the way from Helena on down to Great Falls, and then of course the Madison, and a smaller coal-fired power plant in Billings, and then of course the larger Colstrip facility, which is the primary subject for climate change. Now, PPL Montana takes its commitment to the environment very seriously. Richard Opper talked about the mercury regulation. Last year, the Board of Environmental Review approved what we believe is the most stringent mercury regulation in the country. We're particularly at a disadvantage in Montana because this rule is so stringent. I could get into the scientifics of it later, but Montana's coal that we use is subbituminous coal. It's very low in mercury to begin with. And so we're at a disadvantage in trying to remove a great percentage of mercury from that coal when compared to other states that use bituminous coal, which has a higher percentage of mercury, easier to remove. However, we've been testing a number of different technologies at Colstrip, and very recently we've been encouraged by some of the results that we've seen, and we'll be sharing that very soon. But we also take the issue of climate change very seriously. But like mercury emissions, this isn't going to be easy. There's no commercially available technology to remove significant amounts of mercury from existing coal-fired power plants like Colstrip, and there is no commercially available technology to remove carbon dioxide from these types of coal plants. But the climate change issue really came into focus for our industry last year when the U.S. cap companies, these were Duke Energy, General Electric, Caterpillar, came together and publicly urged Congress to do something about climate change. We took that very seriously as well, and since that time, we gave our public support to a piece of legislation in the Senate sponsored by Senators Bingaman and Specter. It's called the Low Carbon Economy Act. Now, this bill provides some market incentives. It's a cap-and-trade program, an overall national cap on carbon emissions. It sets a price of $12 per metric ton on those emissions, but it also gets the entire global economy involved on this because it sets a tariff on the importation of high-carbon products to this country unless those nations also install the same type of carbon capture equipment that we would be installing. So we see that as a very serious attempt at addressing this very serious issue, but also addressing it on a global scale, and we all believe that it's a global problem. I've also been involved in this issue on regional and state level. Richard Opper mentioned the Montana Climate Change Advisory Committee. I was appointed to that last year, spent the entire last year meeting periodically with several of the folks in this room, trying to come up with unique ideas to address this global issue from a Montana perspective. Since we have different bosses, I think I can talk about a few of the details here that Richard was reluctant to do. Plus, I think he left the room, so I'm safe. So I'll get into a few of these. There were some positives and negatives about this experience from my view. Some of the positives, I think the panel recognized the value of having market solutions to this issue. Recognized the value of having hydroelectric facilities as a renewable resource to a certain extent, and it also provided a lot of incentives for energy efficiency. Now, some of the negatives were on renewable portfolio standards. Montana has an existing standard that by 2015, 15% of our energy is to be a renewable resource, and that's great. This recommendation would ramp that up to 20% by 2020 and 25% by 2025. And while that's an admirable goal, I think that's going to be very difficult for industries to reach in this state. One thing that would be very beneficial would be if this recommendation were to allow new generation gains made through efficiency at existing hydro facilities to be counted toward that standard. For example, our company runs the Kerr hydroelectric facility up in Polson. We recently installed a new runner which achieved 12 additional megawatts of electricity at that facility. We believe that incremental increase in generation ought to be counted as a new generation that's clean and green and should be counted towards the renewable standard. We believe things like that ought to be counted, and we plan to do additional efficiency upgrades at some of our other facilities. Number two, the generation performance standards. This is the one that we really had a lot of heartache with. This would be very similar to what has already been implemented in the state of California. Load-serving entities would be required to purchase electricity only from facilities that capture and sequester 50% of their carbon dioxide emissions. Again, that's an admirable goal, but we're a long ways away from being able to do that, especially in the time frame under this recommendation. What this would effectively do would prevent any electricity consumer in the state of Montana from buying electricity from Colstrip. And I can't emphasize enough the strategic importance of Colstrip and its 2,100 megawatts. This is the only facility, coal is the only type of facility in Montana that operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to meet demand. Renewable energy sources, I think, are definitely part of the future, but they're going to be a component along with clean coal. The Climate Change Panel also recognized another significant issue, and that was that the liability issue was not assigned. It's not assigned through any law in the state of Montana or statute. It's not assigned through case law, and so that's one thing that I believe this next legislature ought to be dealing with, because companies like mine love certainty. We love regulatory certainty, and I think certainty about the liability of what we're going to do should we be able to capture carbon dioxide and sequester it. The 2007 Montana legislative session was heavily involved in the climate change issue, as well as Dr. Erickson talked about earlier. There were no fewer than 12 climate change bills discussed, everything from putting in California's climate change plan to assignment of eminent domain and common carrier status for pipelines carrying carbon dioxide. We supported and opposed a lot of these bills, but I thought it was great that the legislature engaged in these. However, the only piece of legislation that really survived, and it didn't even survive the regular session, was the governor's Clean and Green initiative. And we were proud to help Evan write some sections of that and helped push that through during the special session too. One thing I liked is, now Evan must be a Star Wars fan of some sort, because this bill did get a new name during the special session. It was the Jobs and Energy Development Incentives Act, or JEDI. But what happened with that is we ended up with a 50% tax reduction for equipment used to capture, compress, transport, and sequester carbon dioxide. Now that might not sound like a big deal to this room, but it really is to a company like mine, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, really in research and development. This is not something that you buy off the shelf. This is Brave New World type of endeavor here that we're looking at. And so it's important to get the right kind of incentive to drive that so that we could all benefit from that at a later time. One of the things I thought was really get to the next one here. Oh, I almost forgot to mention the interim committees. Both energy-related interim committees are currently working on climate change legislation and ideas as well. The Environmental Quality Council has met a couple of times and talked about this, and then more importantly, the Energy Telecommunications Interim Committee is dealing with the climate change issue. In fact, thank you, we're hosting the committee on a tour of the Colstrip facility next week, where we'll show them our plans to deal with the climate change issue. I'd better get moving here. We believe that the importance of the Clean and Green, or JEDI bill, was that it recognizes the value of Montana coal. Right now, the Colstrip facility produces about 2,100 megawatts of electricity. And I wanted to illustrate what that means. About 14 years ago, 1 megawatt of electricity was enough power to go to about 1,000 homes, around 1,000 homes. A couple of years ago, it's 800 homes for 1 megawatt of electricity. Today, it's 650 homes for 1 megawatt of electricity. So we are using a lot more electricity than we used to. Our demand is going up instead of down. And the only way I believe that we're going to meet that need is continued use of coal. And it has to be clean. And that's why we're working on that. So what's our strategy? Carbon capture, carbon sequestration, enhanced oil recovery. We're members of the Future Gen Industrial Alliance, and we're also making a major investment in renewable energy. We've looked at 3 different carbon capture technologies. This ought to give you an idea of some of the expense. The first thing that we looked at was an amine scrubber system. We're looking at a capital cost of $333 million. Annual operation and maintenance costs of $620 million. This is some real money, folks. The biggest problem with these is right here. Each of these technologies has an energy penalty. This one is 30%. That's 30% of the megawatts produced at the Colstrip plant just to run the new equipment. Cost of removal, about $35 a ton for 90% capture. We've looked at some alternate technologies. Green fuel. This is actually an algae that's grown in a housing. Flue gas is extracted from the stack, runs through this housing, and it grows algae. Algae consume carbon dioxide and other pollutants, and then you eventually harvest that algae and make biofuels out of it. It's an interesting concept developed by NASA. $1.7 billion capital costs. There is some revenue for the biofuels, but potential cost is still pretty expensive, and this technology is far from being ready to go. The best one we've looked at so far, we borrowed from Tim Grigori over at Southern Montana Electric, who's in the room, is chilled ammonia. This is from Alstom. 90% capture of CO2. Pretty expensive on the capital and O&M, but the energy penalty is the key here, only about 9%, so that makes that much more viable. So like I mentioned, we're looking at deep saline formations. We were told by the Big Sky Carbon Sequestration Partnership, of which we're members, there's a significant one right underneath the coal strip plant. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at enhanced oil recovery. There's a company that told us they have a lot of the depleted oil reserves out in eastern Montana, and we'll take every bit of CO2 that we can get them by way of pipeline. We're also looking at terrestrial offsets. This would be forestry and agriculture and rangeland projects that would give us credits that we could trade on the Chicago Climate Exchange. We're one of only 4 power company members of the Future Gen Industrial Alliance. This is a Department of Energy industry consortium to develop the world's cleanest coal-fired power plant. We're doing a lot of the funding, design, and also siting of the plant. The idea here is that we would have a hydrogen byproduct that could be used for other industrial purposes, but what we really want to develop here is some ideas that we can implement for retrofits of existing plants and design of new plants that can burn clean coal. We're spending $100 million over the next 5 years on renewable energy projects, such as this solar project, which I wish we did in Montana, but we did here in New Jersey. The entire roof of this Macy's department store is a solar panel. This thing produces enough electricity to run that entire store, but also the remainder goes into the grid. We've done landfill gas projects and fuel cells, and looking at a lot of different things. But the overall message that I wanted to get across is that we believe through all of these efforts that coal has to remain the reliable, secure energy source for the future of this country. And thanks for your attention.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Probably have to put the microphone on here. I'm fighting a cold, so I'm trying to drink some water. And I'm Gail Small from Lambrecht, Montana. I flew in this morning, and it's been a long day already, and I know it's been a long day for many of you students that are here. I wanted to respond to the 2 previous panel presentations that we've had, and I want to do it primarily from a student perspective, like a law student perspective, because I see most of the audience, especially back here, are students. And first of all, I want to encourage you to be involved in this issue. The issue of public land law is very important in Montana, and it's a very rewarding career. I think that if you look at the area of the government, both the state, the federal, the local, getting involved in this area is so important, especially when you look at like the public trust doctrine. Your expertise really in this area can implement that for the future generations in such a significant way. So I do public interest law, I think, mainly for Indian tribes. And I've always found that it seems like there's almost like a cultural trust that we also need to be aware of when it comes to looking at the long-term vision of what we want for the state of Montana, what we want for our region, and what we want for this country. And the last few years of my work, I've done more on international level, and it's really brought home to me. Like I've been to China. Some of the earlier speakers were talking about the haze, the coal haze in China, and it's really true. And just the number of people, the population in China, I was shocked that there's so many people. They're actually were digging caves into their burial sites, and people were living in these caves. There were so many people. It's an eye-opening experience, and I encourage you students to travel. And learn. I think some of the best education you can get is to travel and learn what other countries are doing and what the challenges that we face in this country. So in looking at the issues that we have before us, I really think it's important that we take a global approach, because all the energy resources that we're talking about are transitory in nature. They travel. Whether it's the energy resource itself, an issue I'm deeply involved in right now is coal bed methane gas. And it's a very young field in the area that I'm dealing with in the Powder River region. And it's very transitory. It's coming down from the Wyoming area into the Tongue River Basin and directly affects both the Crow and the Northern Cheyenne reservations. And so, we have to be careful in terms of looking at our issues in a very narrow manner, because there's very many jurisdictions that oftentimes we get into these conflicts, whether it's the counties that we're dealing with, and we have a lot of counties right now that are trying to actually regulate coal-bed methane, for example, through zoning laws. You look at the Bozeman Pass area, you're seeing it there. You're seeing it in Rosewood County where Colstrip is located. And then, you look at the state jurisdictions, you look at the federal jurisdictions, and on top of that, you've got the Indian tribal jurisdictions. And I think it's important for you students to take Indian law. I graduated from the University of Montana many years ago, and I wanted to go to law school here at the time. They didn't teach Indian law here at this law school. And that was a major reason I didn't go to school here. I thought that here we are in Montana with 7 Indian reservations. We own tremendous natural resources, and we didn't offer Indian law when I started law school. So I left and I went to the University of Oregon, where Charles Wilkinson taught federal Indian law, and he offered a number of courses in public land law. So I think we're moving forward, I guess, is what I'm saying, in the state of Montana. But I think it's kind of ironic that the 2 speakers before me, what popped into my mind after listening to them is in contrast to what Rebecca Watson said this morning, that the state of Montana is really open for business. That's what it appears. We're open for business. And it sounds that, it struck me being in a law school environment like this. When I first started law school, we had a class called LAP, Legislative and Administrative Process, I believe it was. But the professor, who actually became the governor of Oregon, he was all over. It just seemed like his classes were so scattered and all over. It was very difficult to focus on what particularly we were trying to do or learn from that area. And looking at the governor's plan for energy and the green movement as is being pushed, it seems like it's so all over. And I think we need to focus more specifically. And what would be helpful, I think, in Montana, which is so huge as a state, is really focus on geographic locations and be very clear in terms of what we are hoping to benefit from in those areas. Like I noticed the, what was it called? The Montana Cowboy Boot Economy. Well, you look at that cowboy boot economy, it leaves out, the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. We're clearly not in that economy that's growing in this area. The Crow reservations, all the reservations really are out except for the Flathead. All the 6 reservations are out. But what do they possess? Some of your most valuable natural resources in the state of Montana are in this region. And, we can't be left out. And I guess that was the question. I was visiting with Mei Lin, one of the professors here earlier during the break, and we were. What is the consultation process, government to government, that's taking place here to develop these types of energy plans, these policies that are being pushed by our government in the state of Montana? Where do these tribal governments fit into this policy? I really think it's important that we start having more open communications. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves, where we were in the 70s and where we see ourselves now in many of our energy conflicts, where we're in direct litigation against some of these initiatives. I was listening to the radio the other day, and they were talking about, I think Bacchus was saying that the Blackfeet water rights, the Highline Water Project was just passed through the Senate, which is a big deal for the state of Montana along the Northern Highline. And what struck me was that the Blackfeet tribe have yet to quantify their water, but their water source for this entire diversion along the Highline there is coming from the Blackfeet reservation. And there's that type of communication. It needs, what we're doing is we're building a position where there's going to be conflict if we're not clear and we don't bring the parties in at a very initial stage. We're seeing that with the coal bed methane. We've been fighting in our area of southeastern Montana for 6 years now. And I was always struck when I was on the Tribes Negotiating Committee that the Bureau of Land Management and the state of Montana put in over $4 million into doing this environmental impact statement. $4 million. And Conrad Burns came up at one of the hearings and he said, if you need any more money, you just let me know. And our tribes, Crow and Cheyenne, directly in the area, in fact, there's methane wells pumping right now that are less than 3 miles from the Crow Indian Reservation. We came up to the same negotiating table and requested assistance in being involved in the environmental impact statement as governments, federally recognized governments. It took us 2 years to get $150,000 each, compared to $4 million. This is the inequity that is paramount in this state when it comes to energy development, and how difficult it is for those of us that live in these areas. As Rebecca Watson said, you're in ground zero. Well, clearly we're in ground zero. We live in ground zero. I mean, you look at northern Cheyenne, you have the largest coal-fired power plants in the country, 12 miles below us. We're looking at, there's a lot of different estimates, but thousands of coal bed methane wells all around us. They're pumping water already into the Tongue River. We're in conflict in just every area. We tried to look at the need to work with the state of Montana. We worked real hard in trying to come up with water quality standards, regulating the water discharge into the rivers. But we have a conflict, I think, in our thinking between the market economy, whether it's the cap and trade or, whatever it is that, we learn in our systems here. Like the tribes were saying, water is so precious. Is it something that we have to accept that they're going to pump all the groundwater out of southeastern Montana to get that coal bed methane? And are we going to be around in 6 to 7 generations? That's how long the scientists are saying it's going to take to replenish the aquifers in our area after it's drained. What is more important, I guess, is the question that we have. Is it the water or is it the methane? Or is it the fact that, the only people that are living out in that area are primarily us, Indian tribes? We live along the Tongue River. We are the largest populations in the area. We are the nearest governments in that area, and we're federally recognized governments. And the only way we've had our voice heard is through litigation, and it's been a David and Goliath fight. We've got $150,000, and we're waging a battle of, $4 million, plus whatever the energy companies have. So, I'm running out of time, and I had a lot of other things, but I really do want to push technology. I think technology is critical. If we could develop some type of economic incentives so that people would develop the technology where they could get the methane out of the ground, for example, without draining the entire aquifers of southeastern Montana. I mean, the Northern Cheyennes, the Crows, they would be at that table, encouraging that type of technology development. Same thing with coal strip. I mean, we hear how great, the plans are of PP&L, but look back in the 1970s when the Northern Cheyenne had to actually redesignate their air to Class 1 air quality just to get to where we are today. And in order to do that, we had to sue EPA and the power plants. And that was like a 12-year running battle. And it was a David and Goliath battle again. So I come at this, from getting out of law school, being heavily engaged in all these energy issues. And it's kind of like what Wally McCrae said down on the Rosebud. He's a poet. But he said, and it always struck me, that we've learned that you have to hold their feet to the fire before you're going to even be at that table. And it's unfortunate that it's still like that. But I really believe that we need to open our communications and be respectful of the communities, whether they're brown or white, that are impacted in these regions. Because this idea of national sacrifice areas, which they called our area, It's going to become a national sacrifice area. I mean, those communities are going to fight, to live there. Their future is there. They have very strong cultural ties to that area. So we need to broaden our perspectives, I think, as Montanans. Thank you.
While he's setting that up, my name is Ann Hedges, and as Evan knows, I'm a contrarian oftentimes to some of the governor's energy policies, and I plan on playing that role today. I have a lot of respect for our governor in many areas. I think, though, that energy policy is one where I think he could put his energy enthusiasm and really brilliant mind to better use and come up with a better product. So I looked at this from the perspective of the agenda, and it was the governor's clean and green energy policy sustainable and transferable? And I think in order to look at that question, you have to ask what the governor's energy policy really is. And I think that this is the matter of some debate. Let's look first at what clean and green was in the legislature. What was the clean and green bill that the governor pushed in the legislature? And what you'll see here is it's property tax incentives, it's property tax abatement, it's property tax exemptions, it's new classes of property. It's all about property taxes. Now, I would argue that clean and green is not energy policy, it's a tax policy. And that tax policy doesn't require 100% carbon sequestration. That tax policy gives tax breaks if somebody sequesters just 65% of the carbon. And that tax policy doesn't tell you what sequestration really means. Like in 5 years, if carbon sequestration doesn't work, if you find that you've contaminated groundwater, or if you find that the carbon is leaking out of that area, that geologic formation, what happens? Do they have to give the money back? Do they have to pay back taxes? No, that's not discussed. So I would argue that this is simply, clean and green, is simply a tax policy. And the tax subsidies are not the best thing to use as for environmental policy. They're better for economic development, possibly, but that's even debatable. Paul O'Neill, Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. I think I need to change this, sorry. He said, if you're going to give money away, I'll take it. If you want to give me inducements for something I'm going to do anyway, I'll take it. But good business people do not do things because of inducements. They do them for other reasons. Michael Bloomberg, mayor of New York City, and very wealthy man, said any company that makes a decision based on the tax rate is a company that won't be around very long. If you're down to that incremental margin, you don't have a business. So I would argue that tax breaks are not our best use of resources for trying to get where we want to go. Now, this is a Montana example. This is the coal tax. Now, if you look at this historically, in 1976, we implemented a 30% tax on coal in this state. You'll see in 1987, we reduced that. We cut that in half. You'll see that the production level, which is the red line, really hasn't changed at all. You'll see that the revenue went up with a higher tax and then went down. But production never actually changed. Now, so the governor's policy, I would argue, is more of a tax policy. I would say an energy policy needs to be a little bit more holistic. We need to look at efficiency. So I look at what does the governor talk about when he talks about efficiency. He doesn't talk about electricity, except when he refers to Jimmy Carter and the Carter era. And they told Americans, Jimmy Carter told Americans to put on sweaters. He told us to sacrifice. And Americans aren't good at sacrifice. That is our governor's line. It's insufficient. When he talks about efficiency, just like Evan Barrett did, talks about it only in terms of fuel, transportation, not in terms of electricity. We have to get at both. And one of the most annoying comments I hear from our governor is that if you are not on board with developing increased fossil fuels, natural resources, then you're going to be living naked in trees eating nuts. And that, to me, is offensive because I think we can have a good energy policy that can be more holistic, that doesn't require us to live naked in trees. Now, energy efficiency is where we should start. And that was referred to a little tiny bit this morning. But let's look at where it has worked. Energy efficiency is not a great idea that is virtuous. It is actually one that works. And in California, they started in the 70s implementing energy efficiency policies. They were aggressive. This is per capita energy consumption. The top line is US. You can see per capita, energy consumption is increasing. You can see in California, it's flat. How has that happened? Darn it. How has that happened? Because in California, they have implemented a whole series of energy efficiency programs. And they start with utilities, they go to appliances, they've looked at it holistically and they've said, how can we get the most efficiency out of the system? They've gotten 15% of their energy needs met through efficiency since the 70s. And I'll tell you right now, California isn't stopping. California has a very aggressive program to continue getting efficiency out of the system. This is the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. This is how they project we can meet our energy needs in the Pacific Northwest. And what they say until 2025, the bottom area is conservation. We can meet, the next area, the light green, is wind. We can meet the growth in demand in the Pacific Northwest with energy conservation and wind. They have a little tiny black line at the very top for coal. That's it. And people think that that was just a political gimme to Montana. So they're saying we can meet increased energy demand with energy conservation and renewables. It's not just us saying it. So is the governor's plan it's not really about efficiency, is it about renewables? The governor has done something really important on renewable energy. He helped pass and he signed the Renewable Energy Standard. Now that is a great start. That doesn't apply to electric co-ops. So while we're going to try and get renewable use of renewables being used for energy, in half of Montana, that standard doesn't apply. We need to expand the renewable energy standard to co-ops as well. The governor's energy campaign actually isn't about efficiency and it's not about renewables, it's more about coal to liquids. And how do I know this? Because I've watched him on all of these programs. I've read his editorials. The New York Times, Charlie Rose, 60 Minutes, Billings Gazette, the Helen Independent Record, and my favorite, the Colbert Report, where America gets its news. And on all of them, what does he talk about? He talks about coal to liquids. Now, why isn't Montana coal being developed? Could it be our strict environmental laws? Well, no. We've been gutting those for the last decade. I know, I'm an environmental lobbyist. And we have gutted the Major Facility Siting Act. We've weakened our water quality laws. We've gutted MEPA. I can go on. It's not our strict environmental laws. It's not our poor business climate. We were just rated as one of the best business climates in America. That's on the governor's website. Is it something else? And I would say yes. It's distance to markets. Wyoming is closer, hundreds of miles closer to where the markets for energy are. Is it transportation costs? Yes. Leo, it's a penny a ton a mile to haul coal, generally. And if you're hauling 1 million tons of coal a year, that adds up. If you can get it from Wyoming, it's a business decision to do so. Sufficient supply closer to demand, absolutely. Other places have coal and are developing those resources. It's harder to mine. In Montana, our coal isn't uniform. Some places, it is different quality, it's different depths, it's different, not just depths to get to it, but the actual coal seam can be very shallow. So coal quality is also different than in Wyoming. But this is the number one reason that coal isn't moving right now. It's about CO2. It is about carbon. And anybody who doesn't talk about an energy policy in terms of carbon is not looking into the future. Now, coal is becoming riskier, and I would argue that our governor should not be hitching his wagon to coal. Now, what's the market saying about coal? $32 billion private equity deal earlier this year to buy out TXU in Texas. They cut out 8 of 11 coal plants right off the bat. You had recent reversals on coal plant decisions in Florida, North Carolina, and Oregon. Nearly 24 coal projects have been canceled since 2006. Senate Majority Leader, as somebody said this morning, he didn't have to do this. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said he opposes all new coal-fired power plants in Nevada. And this is what Wall Street's saying about coal. They're saying election politics are likely to turn bestial for coal. This is in July of this year. We have no buys in coal. We expect anti-coal politics to intensify, with carbon constraints almost certain to pinch. So the Wall Street Journal is saying this. This is not environmentalists. This is people saying coal is going to cost something soon, and we should think about it. Why is coal to liquids a problem in that environment? Because coal to liquids emits twice the CO2 as regular petroleum-based fuels. Even with carbon sequestration, you can see that little red line, it's 4% more CO2 than traditional petroleum products. So in a carbon-constrained world, this simply doesn't make sense. Scientific American just came out with an editorial this last summer. And in it they said, it's worse than gasoline. They said liquid coal would produce roughly twice the global warming emissions as gasoline. The country would be spending billions in loans, tax incentives, and price guarantees to lock in a technology that produces more greenhouse gases than gasoline does. This is unacceptable. Instead of spending billions to subsidize a massively polluting industry, we should be investing in efficiency and in renewable energy technologies that can help us constrain global warming today. Okay. There was a study that just came out this year. A lot of people say, including the governor, we're going to get coal done, and including Mr. Grigori with the Highwood plant. We're going to get coal done, and we're going to sequester that carbon. Don't you worry. We're going to capture it and sequester it. Well, in fact, MIT just did a report on carbon capture and sequestration. And their fundamental premise or assumption is that coal's going to be with us for a long time. But what they did say, let me find a couple quotes for you, is that in order to make carbon capture and sequestration work, it's going to take a regulatory framework that puts a price on carbon, whether that's a tax or cap and trade, but a price on carbon of $25 a ton, increasing in real dollars at 4% a year by the year 2015. Now, Congress is talking about $10 per ton with big, huge safety valves. $25 a ton in order to make carbon capture and sequestration economically viable. That's what they're saying. They also say that the scale of carbon capture and sequestration required to make a major difference in global greenhouse gas concentrations is massive. The only place, well, I shouldn't say that. There's very few places that they're actually trying out this technology. The biggest project they have going right now is in the North Sea. And they are only sequestering 1 million tons a year. Now, the Highwood plant is going to put out over 2 million tons a year. It's a relatively small plant of CO2. So the biggest project going today is only doing 1 million tons a year. And you know why they're doing it in Norway? Because in Norway they have a carbon tax. And they implemented that carbon tax sometime around 1992. And 5 years later, they found ways to deal with their carbon. Their carbon tax is very high. So this is what MIT says. The largest sequestration project is small. Enhanced oil recovery projects are not good indicators of how this technology is going to work. And we need to get moving on it fast. What I would argue is Is this carbon capture and sequestration the answer? Carbon capture to capturing that carbon out of the flue gas from these plants, it's not developed yet. They're still working on it. They have ideas, but it's not ready. Sequestration is not ready for prime time. It's 10 or 15 to 20 years out, and that's according to the Department of Energy, which is wildly optimistic about coal. So sequestration is not ready for prime time. We couldn't even pass a bill this session that doesn't require sequestration. It just sets up a regulatory framework for sequestration. The governor's office tried to help us pass that bill. It died on party lines in the House. We got 38 out of 50 votes in the Senate. Wildly bipartisan to pass a regulatory framework for carbon sequestration. And in the partisan politics in the House, we couldn't get it out of committee. And this was not mandating. It was just saying, this is dangerous stuff. We need to know how it's going to work. We need to have site selection. We need to have verification. We need to monitor. We need to do enforcement. We need to talk about liability. This was not cutting edge. This was not edge of your seat. We're going to require a whole bunch. This was just, what's it going to look like? And we couldn't even get that passed. So there's no regulatory framework. Sequestration is expensive, as the MIT report said. You need at least a very high value associated with carbon in order to make this economic. And the resources for this enormous investment divert attention away from where we really need to go. And that is energy efficiency, conservation, and renewables. If we would put that money in those three things, we could be energy independent. The Highwood developer has been quoted many times as saying they want to be involved in carbon sequestration if it's feasible and if they can afford to pay the added costs. Well, I would argue relying on those assumptions to say we should move forward with new coal plants when we already have a problem with our existing carbon emissions, let alone adding to them, doesn't make any sense. Until we prove that technology with things like coal strip, and we start bringing down our carbon emissions at existing coal plants, we shouldn't be building new coal plants based upon the assumption that technology will hopefully save us. So the Northwest Power and Conservation Council just came out with another study in the last 2 weeks that said the same thing I just said. Well, kind of. They said we need to start, in order to decrease our carbon footprint in the area, we have to talk about which coal plants we're going to shut down, not build new ones. That's my words, not theirs. But we need to talk about how we're really going to get to stabilization and reduction of CO2 levels. We cannot do it by continuing to rely on coal and building more coal plants. I'd say a good energy plan, please listen, is more than just supply side. It is also demand side. It's got to be demand side. If we cannot figure out how to reduce consumption, we will never get there. I think that the Governor's Climate Change Advisory Committee's recommendations, which do take into account energy efficiency, talk about ways to get there, conservation, renewables, and talks about what to do with carbon capture and sequestration. It really is a more holistic view of how we should go after energy. I think that's what the governor's office should do. That should be their starting point for an energy policy. But when the governor's office energy policy, no offense, Evan, is presented by his economic development director, I say you have a fundamental flaw. Energy policy has to be broader than that. So I would hopefully recommend that the governor's office get on board with not just supply side, but demand side, because we're not going to get where we have to go without it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Bob Rainey. I'm a Public Service Commissioner, and I represent Southwest Montana. And Anna's a tough one to follow because she took up a whole bunch of the subjects I was going to talk about, so I should be able to stay within the time limits easily. The major point I want to make is that there is a tremendous difference between Montana's energy needs and developing energy in Montana for economic development. They're considerably different things. So first, let's talk about Montana's energy needs. Overall, we don't need a new coal plant. We have a cooperative, a group of cooperatives that believe we do, and they're proceeding forward with it. But overall, through the Northwest Energy, which is a big share of Montana, and the rest of the cooperatives in MDU, we're okay on energy in our state. We need steady growth that grows with Montana. But we don't really need supply. That's the whole point. It's time that we turn away from only thinking about supply and what that does to the cost of energy and what it does to the environment. And so we've heard talk about efficiency and conservation. All across our country, we know that that's the way to go. But we're not doing it in very much of our country. The Californians, for sure, are leading the way. And following them comes New York. Isn't it interesting that where these massive populations are, they are in fact working towards energy efficiency and conservation. And just what does that mean, conservation? Use less. Use less. There's lots of ways to use less. Go buy the curlicue CFL bulbs. They only use 1/4 the energy. There's other ways to use less. Industrially, they redesign their motors. So a motor that draws a megawatt may only have to draw 3/4 of a megawatt. That's efficiency. Efficiency that improves 12 megawatts at a dam, so that instead of having to increase water flow over the dam, they increase the efficiency of the production itself. We need to be moving in that direction. Then there's demand-side management, which is complicated, but what it means is that we want to shave off the most expensive electricity costs and move them to other parts of the day when electricity doesn't cost so much. Also, when you move them to the other parts of the day, you move them to more efficient generators. So we need to be able to say to you, all of you with businesses and et cetera, that at certain hours of the day, we're going to cut or curtail your use of electricity. So at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, when we have the hugest demand for electricity, in July especially, and the costs are enormous because every plant everywhere, no matter how efficient it is operating, that is the time to shift the load away from 6 o'clock. So with demand-side management, we can shut off your air conditioner at 6 o'clock for 15 minutes, then shut off your neighbors for 15 minutes. And thus, everybody is not drawing at the same time, and we can shift load. By shifting load, it may mean that we need one less gas generator somewhere in Montana. Renewables are ready. Renewables, wind. It's the #1 renewable. But are we using wind in its best forms? No, we're not. We haven't advanced the technology of wind. Wind must be firmed. It only produces its required amount 1/3 of the time. And we don't even know when that 1/3 of the time is going to be. So to make wind work better, we have got to find ways to do that. Presently, we use dams, and those dams are in Idaho, to make our wind project work. We also use a gas plant near Butte, and we're going to build other gas plants in Montana. Northwest Energy will be building a gas plant. This is to make sure that the electricity is functioning perfectly, 24 hours a day. No matter how many people are turning light switches on or off, turning on televisions, etc., the electricity has to run perfect, and it takes firming power. So Montana needs to do that. Well, we're going to do it with gas, so we're going to produce CO2. But with innovation, we're going to get away from that. Compressed air storage. So when a windmill is operating at 3 o'clock in the morning, that electricity is not needed. The dams and the base load generators at Colstrip are providing that electricity to us. So those windmills should be doing something else at that hour of the day. And that is, one suggestion, is pumping air into the ground. And when the wind quits blowing, you bring the air back out of the ground and run your generator. We can do that in Montana. There's lots of ideas on it. New technology. One of them is the smart grid. Right now you just have a meter on your house, and it bills you through the utility. And it bills you at the same price no matter what hour of the day you use it. But in fact, electricity is very cheap at 3 a.m. and very expensive at 6 p.m. We need to make people use more energy at 3 o'clock in the morning and use less at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. It only makes good sense. Shifting load, and we're going to do it, but we have to be able to incentivize people to do it. Right now, you have no incentive to run your washing machine at 3 a.m. or to run your dishwasher at 3 a.m. But if we go to smart meters, then we can go to real-time pricing. So if you are washing your dishes at 6 p.m., you're going to be paying through the nose to do that. So you won't. You'll look at the little meter on your wall and it'll be flashing bright red, meaning that the electricity is very expensive, and you won't turn things on. You will set the timer and it'll come on at 3 a.m. when the electricity is cheap. Okay? That's what happens when we go to the smart grid. But you're going to pay for that. That meter is going to cost money. Making that meter work within the system is going to cost money. Your rates will go up in order to use less electricity and therefore save our planet from dying. If CO2 is what we're trying to reduce, then we have to move in all of these directions. In the long term, Montana has to invest in sustainable generation or figure out ways to make it sustainable. And that is using all of our wind power in all the ways we can. We have orphan gas wells around Montana right now that have been drilled, but they're not connected to the gas gathering systems. We can take portable generators to those spots and use them. We can use them in coordination with wind and make them even more efficient. And this is where being at the university comes in. Because all of these things are already, technology for all these things is already well known. It's implementing it. It's putting it in place and getting with it. And that needs to come through the university system working with the administration of this state and say, we're moving forward. Here it is, and here's the investments. Who wants on board? We have plenty of people at this university, at Butte Tech and at MSU, already engaged in all of these fields of renewable energy and technology that we can implement in Montana because there's only 900,000 people here. So we can do it. These would also be good things to do all around the country as well. But we have a better chance. Now there's the discussion of, I'm going to get into economic development now. And the first thing about economic development that is discussed is, well, we'll have to have transmission lines. And I want to run up a red flag about new transmission lines going out of Montana. Some may say they're coming in. I say they're going out. And why should we be concerned? For example, the Mattel line that runs to Alberta. Well, first off, Alberta is a net importer of electricity. Montana is a net exporter of electricity. What is going to happen when you connect a line between us and Canada? Are we going to suddenly get Canadian electricity? Or are the Canadians going to get our electricity? And if the Canadians get our electricity, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to build an expensive plant to replace the energy that they just took, or we're going to pay what they're willing to pay. And when we connect a line to California, what do you think is going to happen? So just saying that building transmission lines will be good is not necessarily true. In fact, it could be just the opposite. The thought that Montana is the place to do coal development kind of rings hollow. The fact that we have 1/3 of the coal or 1/4 of the coal of the nation doesn't mean very much. Coal is all over our country. Utah is covered with coal. North Dakota has ample amounts of coal. Wyoming has huge deposits of coal that are easier to mine, better coal when you get there, and closer to market. There's immense coal in Kentucky and West Virginia and Illinois. And there's also all the places that sequester the carbon there. So when we get into thinking about coal development, why don't we think about all the things involved with coal development? First and foremost is water. Now, the governor and Evan Barrett have said that, don't worry about the water. Well, Great River Energy is about to build a coal-to-liquid plant in eastern North Dakota. I met with them and another member of the governor's staff about 3 weeks ago or a month ago, and the one thing they wanted us to understand was you need lots of water, so you should build it by a reservoir. I said, you're not going to use surface water, you're not going to use groundwater to run a big enough coal to liquid plant to make it economical. So when is Montana going to have the discussion about water? Do you think that we should take all the available future water of Montana, especially since we've entered global warming era, and use it to produce energy for the rest of the country? Or perhaps we should save that water for agriculture, municipal uses, or whatever we come up with in the future. Because once you commit it to coal, once you commit it to energy development, that's 50 years your water's gone for a minimum. I don't think that's a great idea. Then we have to come up with wastewater disposal from these plants as well. Are they going to be allowed to put it into our surface waters as they're doing with coal bed methane? I would hope not. This all has to be answered. I'm getting close to the end and I'm only halfway through my points. Other things that we have to consider, and to me what's most important when it comes to energy development, economic energy development for America, to meet America's needs, we got to get over provincialism. And by provincialism, I mean Montana. We have to get over it. We have to go regional or national in concept. The CO2 pipeline is not going to be a single line from one plant to one disposal well. It's going to be lots of plants connected to major transmission lines, going to large fields where there will be a big distribution system, maybe even similar to what we witness in coal bed methane fields. Is that what we want? We haven't had that discussion in Montana. There's social costs, mining impacts. Who faces all the liability for escaping CO2? What benefits are there to surface landowners? Has that been determined? If the deposit of the CO2 is under your property, are you going to get paid for them for filling it with CO2? We haven't discussed it. What's the future responsibility for monitoring, verifying, and mitigating escaped CO2? Escaping CO2 kills people. A flood of CO2 escaped from a natural reservoir in Africa a number of years ago and killed a whole valley full of people. You can't smell it or see it, you just drown in it. So we have to make sure it's all done right. We haven't even defined sequestration. The sequestration 50%, 65%, 99%, or 100%. We haven't decided that in Montana. We have nothing to prevent escaping gas, no laws. We don't have any public or worker safety planning that's going into all of this yet. We're dealing with a commodity that can kill. And yet we think of it as nothing because it's CO2. We haven't done anything about post-injection closure. So if we have somebody building a field and filling it full of CO2, and when their project is over, who's responsible for the next 1,000 years? Is it going to fall upon us? How are we going to be guaranteed? We don't know. And my time ran out, and I hope I gave you some food for thought. Thank you.
So let's give all of our panelists a round of applause.